Everyone, I'm excited for this episode. I'm excited because we've got an amazing guest. We've got someone with us today that I first met on the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu mats when we were both training at a gym called Dominance in Richmond. It's in Victoria. Before we begin though, I'd like to first give our acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land in which we're on today. I'm here on Ghana country, and since we're online, let us all pay respects to each and every First Nations person, all First Nations peoples, our elders, past, present, and future, and each of the First Nations peoples that might be listening to our podcast today. Without further ado, we've got the one and only Andrew Burnett. He's a barrister. He's a former jiu-jitsu practitioner. How are you, Andrew?
I'm very well, Matthew. Yourself?
Good, thank you, Andrew. It's awesome to be able to have you on this episode. And like I was saying, we've done jiu-jitsu together. We've been in some legal matters, we're working as a team in that way, and now we're podcasters together as well.
Thank you for the invitation.
Andrew, can you share a little bit about yourself and your passions to the people that are listening?
Okay, so my background, I'm a barrister now. I previously worked as a solicitor. We both worked at Clayton Utz together. So the first time I met Matthew on the jiu-jitsu mat, I saw a guy wearing a Clayton Utz t-shirt and I thought he looks like an unfamiliar face. And so I introduced myself and we took it off from there. And we've always been, I guess, stayed in contact. I left Clayton Utz and became a barrister, and Matthew started his own firm, and we've always stayed in touch, trying to encourage each other in the law. And I think Matthew's trying to encourage me to get back on the mat, which is, it's a work in progress for Matthew, I guess. My area of law is commercial law. So generally the type of Matthew and I have been involved in commercial disputes. I guess that part of the discussion that we're going to be having today is to try and work through negotiation. From my perspective, is through dispute resolution. So where parties have engaged in, I guess they've had a fight about something, and then the lawyers are involved to try and find a settlement or to press on to litigation.
That's awesome, Andrew. And I think that one of the things that I love about working with barristers just like you, but obviously you as well, you've got it in spades, is integrity. I think you have a lot of integrity in the work that you do. You've got a lot of honesty in the work that you do. And it's great when we can find allies and people within the profession, any profession, that share similar values. We want to get a lot more guests from that BJJ space into rolling through negotiations. And we call it rolling through negotiations. The rolling is actually a jiu-jitsu term. You know how we say we're going to have a roll, which is like the spar in jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
And I'm excited to have someone, because you were a purple belt, or you are a purple belt in BJJ.
Yeah, I might be down a few notches now because it's been a few years off the mat. But
they say, don't they say once a purple belt, always a purple belt? Or, you can never go down, you can only go up.
That might be the negotiation I have with the instructor when I start rolling again.
Yeah.
But,
I would love to ask you a couple of questions around the jiu-jitsu, right? What I'd love to ask you is, if you reflect back at your jiu-jitsu journey, is there anything that stands out or that you remember learning about sort of mindset and about putting you in the right place and in the right state of mind that you learned through jiu-jitsu?
Sure. So my first class before Dominance was Dominance Mixed Martial Arts. There was a small gym just in the back corner of just off Richmond train station, which I think was Muscle and Fitness Gym. And there was an instructor there, Cameron Rowe, and I went to my first class, and it was very, very confronting. It was, I think, jiu-jitsu at that time, it may not have been as accessible as it is now. And I remember being really confronted by just how I think I was just out of my league. It was like jumping in a swimming pool and you don't know how to swim.
Yeah.
And at that time, I think the first lesson I got from jiu-jitsu was humility, because you saw how people who are trained in that discipline can control someone absolutely versus being a starter. And I think it was 6 months before I really got any confidence in what I was doing on the mat, because just the nature of the activity, it's such a foreign, like you can't bring, I couldn't bring any skill set to the mat. And at that time, what occurred to me on one hand was being out of my depth and not appreciating the activity, but then equally the fact that the instructors were all of the view to try and help people through that and to help them understand what was going on and then to train them. And then part of it is, once you've got that expert knowledge, then you can be the person that's swimming in the swimming pool and everyone else doesn't know how to swim. And I guess that's the two things that I got were, on one hand, being very humbled and really struggling to understand what was going on, but also to leverage off the instructors that we had at that time, and to then be trained and then to be taught and to be pushed. Because one part of jiu-jitsu is you keep finding yourself in these positions where you think it's a dead end, and then you can ask an instructor, okay, well, I'm in this position and I'm being pinned to the mat. What can I do? And most of the instructors, sorry, not most, I think all of the instructors will say there are many different things that can be done, and they can point you in, escapes and counters and all these other things. And part of it is to, I guess, appreciate the value of expert knowledge and the way in which, if you're going through a difficult time, if you have I guess, an expert to sort of guide you through it. That was the sort of the thing that drew me to jiu-jitsu, to sort of see there'd be problems all the time, but the instructors can help you work through those problems.
That's awesome, Andrew. And you touched on some amazing points through your jiu-jitsu journey just now, which we really appreciate. And I'm sure all the deadly listeners would really appreciate as well. I appreciate the way you explained the points about being confronted when you first stepped into the mat, but then through humility, being able to experience the journey of beginning out of your depth, but then being able to go through the learning processes by also surrounding yourself with those mentors and people with expert knowledge. And then through that, being able to really feel that there's always that answer and having experts guide you along the way. And as you speak on that, Andrew, I was thinking that's a little bit like our relationship that we embark on together in some legal matters, because sometimes I go to you as counsel where I'm looking to be able to have a team to be able to achieve great outcomes for clients. But through that, given your role as the barrister, to be able to draw upon your expert knowledge to go on a similar kind of a journey to achieve excellence as a result. And so I really love looking at the way that BJJ principles and the journey of BJJ apply in all different types of negotiations.
Yeah, I think it's one of these tasks where when you're going through, sweating on the mat and wrestling, all these other activities, the crossover to other areas of life, I think one of the things that you'd say is the discipline that you get from spending time on the mat and to be pushed beyond your sort of comfort limits will shine in other areas of your life. So I think, again, back to my early days in jiu-jitsu, and probably most days in jiu-jitsu, but you find yourself in positions with superior opponents, and ordinarily the reaction for some people is, well, this is the end, where if you're given the right tools and the right instructions, and through, I guess, having really great coaches, you can improve day by day to get out of those impossible positions. And what I thought was very difficult. So I always go back to headlock, and you always think when someone's got you in a headlock, they've got the arm around your neck, and you think, well, that's the end of me. And I think, it's sort of the first or second stripe in white belt is headlock escapes, and all of the ways in which, whether the arm is in or the arm is out, they've got you from behind or from the front. There's many different ways. And what would seem to be an impossible position, through knowledge and experience, instructors can point you in a direction where you are able to escape. And what could be seen as something which you can just never escape from, there's many ways to escape from. Do you ever find that when you are training with junior people, how do you find their reaction? Because that's, I think, the purest response is to see people in their early days, and after your experience on the mat, and you're now a purple belt, no, you're a brown belt, excuse me.
Yeah, a brown belt, and looking closer and closer at that black these days.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's amazing. I think the other thing with belts is it's interesting because there's the ranking system, but I've seen some really amazing blue belts, for example, which for those people that don't do jiu-jitsu, the belt system goes white, blue, purple, brown, black, and they have a coral belt and then a red belt. I think that's how it goes. Not very many people have gone past the black, but I think it goes black, then coral, then red. And I think it's really interesting where you can also come across some lower ranked belts who are just amazing. And
True.
How we can have journeys and learnings from those people that are higher ranked than us, but also lower ranked. We can really learn from anybody.
Well, there was a time, sorry, I was
No,
I was going to say there was a time at Dominance where we had someone who was an Olympic level wrestler come in, and you'd sort of say, oh, well, how does he know about the ground game compared to Olympic level wrestling, which is more on your feet and standing up? But
is this Talbot that you're speaking of?
Yes, and what a absolute phenomenal athlete, and that's what like you say, you can learn from people like that. Where as much as I had thought he wouldn't be knowledgeable about jiu-jitsu type of knowledge, but what he brings is the wrestling knowledge, and all of the learning from that. And it's fascinating to learn from people like that.
Absolutely. I think Target is absolutely amazing. I'm glad you mentioned Target because I'm going to reach out to him and invite him to be a guest one day because I think he's a fantastic person. He's also you're spot on, right, in terms of him being able to translate his wrestling ability into jiu-jitsu. And he grew up in an environment where from a really young child he got identified as having all the natural talents from Uzbekistan government, recognizing that he had all the talents to become an Olympic level wrestler. So the story that I remember him telling me was that then he was brought into this camp facility from a very young age where he grew up amongst other potential Olympians. So without being with his parents, but with other identified young kids growing up, training wrestling for hours and hours a day from that very young age, and then being able to make his wrestling ability almost like breathing. And one of the things I remember from wrestling with Talgett was the way he was so relaxed and cat-like in his movements. He was incredibly balanced and probably, he still does wrestle. So you can say he is incredibly balanced. He moves so gracefully using next to zero strength. And if you ever see wrestlers as a sport, particularly United States wrestlers, they're incredibly tense, aggressive, full on, and overly powerful in their approach. But Target, through the fluidity of his movement, beat so many people that were bigger than him just through being like that cat. I'm wondering, Andrew, if you think about Target and you're nodding your head here, so it's pretty cool because it means that you can appreciate and maybe even remember how smooth Taggart was in terms of how he moves.
Yes.
Do you think qualities like balance, poise, gracefulness, can they help in a negotiation sense? So, for example, in your work as a barrister or legal disputes you've been involved in, can you see things like fluidity of movement, smoothness, tranquility, the type of wrestler that Target is? Can you see those sort of qualities applying in an environment like a legal dispute type negotiation?
Yeah, most definitely. So I guess one part of all of those qualities that you mentioned are a degree of calmness and not being emotional. One of the things you'd appreciate often happens, you have a client that is emotionally aggrieved about whatever they've gone through and the background. And one of the things as practitioners we can bring to the table is a degree of being unemotional, trying to help them through a commercial negotiation, but with an eye of trying to bring, balance and poise. I've always remembered there was the common catchphrase in jiu-jitsu is leave your ego at the door.
Yes.
So you're not there to try and push an agenda. You're there to try and learn and help others learn. And part of what I think is instilled in all jiu-jitsu students is not trying to be emotional or trying to be, in any way angry or showing any emotions, but to just do the activity to try and help others learn, but to help learn yourself. And with that unemotional state, you can actually be more objective. You can try and see through problems rather than, getting a head full of steam or anything like that. And that's part of also in legal practice. You have clients come in and say, oh, this other person, they did A, B, and C, and, they're such a bad person. I don't think that characterization really helps solve a commercial resolution of a dispute. At the end of the day, you want to try and understand, what has gone wrong, how to try and fix the problem, whether it's contractual or a trust dispute or, whatever the type of issue is. But by being unemotional, by being balanced and poised, you're better off. And you're also more able to draw upon information. You can think clearly. I think that's the other part of, I guess, in jiu-jitsu, we always are taught to try and think through problems rather than use emotions. And,
yes,
leaving your ego at the door means, leaving all of the, I guess, emotional state behind and just trying to focus on how to apply, knowledge of, leverage and so forth to be in the best position on the mat.
That's awesome. And Andrew, when you speak about things like being able to think clearly and then leaving your ego at the door, right? And also the emotion point. What's something that's really interesting is most guests that have come on to Rolling Through Negotiations have spoken about the ways that emotions can negatively impact negotiations and the advantages of being non-emotional. And I can really feel that. And I actually agree with what you're saying there as well. I think also when you look at emotions, there's another side. And I think the other side is as human beings, we're emotional creatures. And as much as we can try to turn off our emotions, I think that emotions are always going to be there. Like a really good example of this is you and I were recently representing our client together in a mediation. And it was sort of a few months ago. And I think we got a good outcome in that mediation. Our client was amazing. And at the end of that mediation, I felt absolutely drained. And I remember sending you a message, or maybe I tried to call you, and there was no answer, no return call. And I think the next day you got back in touch and said, "Sorry, Matthew, I went to sleep after that day's long mediation. I was just feeling so drained." And what was amazing is I was feeling so tired as well. And that showed me that mediation experience was a real emotional experience. And even though we're being professionals throughout the day of the mediation, we achieved a great result. I think that what I learned from that experience is that as much as we try to turn off emotions, they're always going to be with us in negotiations. I was just wondering if you have a different view or if there's anything that you can add into that sort of an experience.
I think on that day, it wasn't an emotional day for me, but it was more both. Well, one side was particularly emotionally charged. I think the client we were acting for was very balanced and very reasonable. But what drained me on the day was just being so careful with my words.
Yes.
An approach that some people can take in negotiation is to just bully the other side and to try and push their way through something. So it's like, if we're going to go back to jiu-jitsu, you can use your power on another person to try and push through a technique or a submission. But if you look at the instructors, none of them use that type of approach. And, Talget is a good example, or, any of the instructors that you and I had, they don't use power. They're not pushing. What they're doing is positioning themselves and putting their body in a way that maximizes position. And I guess on the day, I was just trying to avoid blowing up the dispute or, throwing petrol on what was already a pretty big fire. And by us taking an approach which was unemotional and saying, look, there is a simple dispute. There are two sides to the coin. The mediator that we had was very balanced in a way, because what she said to the parties were, neither of you are bad people. It's just you've come at this from different perspectives. You have been, I think the other side had made some assumptions which were, not actually well-founded. And by shining light on that process, not embarrassing them, but trying to help them understand our perspective. And I think the approach that we took on the day was a very principled approach to say, A, we've got the law on our side, but B, the factual position, as you say about, all of these allegations, none of that was actually well-founded. And by appreciating their position and not, I guess, embarrassing them, but then also just being so careful on the day, we achieved what was a really great settlement, and I think the client has to take a lot of credit for that as well, because their approach was to be very balanced and to be very fair, and then also to be very careful and to be understanding of the other side in the negotiation.
Yes.
And again, I'm not sure if it's a jiu-jitsu thing, but it was just a day where by taking a very objective view and also appreciating, I guess the other side, the angst that they were going through. And I think there were some financial issues and some other things that were going on, but we're able to achieve a settlement by, I think, just having a very, very careful day of negotiation.
Yeah, Andrew, and I really appreciate what you're sharing here as well, because I feel like one of the things you're saying is by employing the right techniques, by employing the right craftsmanship in your work during that particular day of the mediation, which is in itself a negotiation context, then that was a way of being able to steer towards the right result. And I think about that as well in a rolling through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu type context, where if you get a rookie that's training Jiu-Jitsu, they can be extremely inefficient in terms of the way they're moving, the effort they're putting in, and the returns that they get on that investment of energy. And it's really interesting when we look at that from the negotiation type context, because like you were saying, and like you did on this particular day of mediation, where you had the right technique and you were using the right strategies, it meant that we could be really efficient in terms of the outcome, the direction, the angles, and the perspectives that we were negotiating from. And so that altogether meant that there could be a much better and more efficient type result. So it's interesting how technique and efficiency both apply to jiu-jitsu and the negotiation context as well.
And I guess part of that also is to, like you say, for a new person who might be using a lot of body strength and a lot of energy, it's to understand the opponent in some way, and to then, I guess, I think it was Hicks and Gracie that said you've got to flow the go or go with the flow. I'm not sure what he meant, but effectively you've got to appreciate the other there's an opponent, and to sort of use techniques in a way that, say for instance, it's a beginning person, you might have someone that really tenses up their body and locks in a position, but I think most jiu-jitsu people would know that you can't actually maintain that for a very long time, because it's going to exhaust you. And so rather than trying to outmuscle the person, you try and use body position or leverage, or wait for a moment for the person to let up on their body so that you can put yourself in a better position. And I guess that's part of what we had on the day. Was we had a very tense opponent, and by us maneuvering and to try and present a very principled approach to the day, we're able to get a very good settlement for the client.
Absolutely, Andrew. And I think having the right team was a factor there as well, a team that could communicate well together. We had a really good client who is a extremely intelligent woman and a great leader. And you're a gun barrister as well in your own right.
I don't know about that.
Andrew, I'd love to ask you this. In terms of, you've been in a lot of heavy, heated legal disputes. You've been in serious court cases. You've been in a whole range of savvy type negotiations as well. But in all your experiences as a barrister, and in my view, you're a top barrister. So in all of the work that you've done, what are some of the top strategies that commercial litigators and barristers use in their negotiations, or that you use yourself?
The first step has always got to be to, I guess, know the rules in a way. So using a jiu-jitsu type example, if you enter into a competition and the competition it used to be the case that there were some competitions where there were no leg locks. So
Yes.
it was not possible to put locks on people below the waist. And the idea was, because those techniques had a possible risk of injury, that I know the governing bodies decided that wasn't for the junior people. And I guess one aspect of entering any negotiation is to understand, what are the rules that you are going to apply to the dispute, and to understand if it's civil procedure, say, for example, what are the options that are available to the parties in terms of, legal procedure to explore, the alternative dispute resolution. If it's, say, for instance, one of the court systems, all of them have a mandatory dispute resolution process.
Yeah.
Part of the dispute resolution process is making sure that the mediation or the negotiation occurs at a time when the parties are ready for that. So most of the time, you've put a document in on behalf of the client, and then the other side has an opportunity to respond, and then there's a mediation. And one aspect to that approach is that it enables the practitioners to apply legal principles and to say, based upon what has been presented to the court to date, this is the likely outcome, or this is a outcome. Ultimately, a judge has the discretion, and they're the arbiter of any dispute, but parties can rely upon their practitioners to say, this is a possible outcome. Appreciating the other side's position, there might be another possible outcome, but to take almost a principled approach to the negotiation and say, well, if it is the case that, say, for instance, there's issues of liability or matters of money's owing.
Yep.
It's a question of how do you quantify what is owing, and how do you understand what are the principles that a judge would apply to award an amount of money?
Yes.
And I guess the aspect that I've always say in negotiations is to really understand, number one, my client's position, but to also understand the other side's position, and then to try and adopt, again, I go back to the word principled approach, and to try and see how a judge would have regard to the facts to adjudicate on and to come to a conclusion on the dispute. And often it's the case that both sides are able to say, well, as much as my lawyers say, we're in a winning position, there's always a grey area. And because of that grey area invites the opportunity for parties to negotiate.
Yep.
So it's very often the case, and I think you find the same with most of your clients, where as much as you are very confident of your client's position, it's almost impossible to give them a guarantee. And that's because of the human element of a judge and the human element of the client's case. They might have a faulty recollection, or there may be other material which they haven't had regard to. And so I guess one of the aspects whenever you're approaching dispute resolution is to appreciate that because of the element of uncertainty, you try and, I guess, put your client in the best position as possible. But if there is an element of risk, the benefit always of mediation is to try and mitigate risk and to allow the parties to walk away. And in one sense, in terms of dispute resolution always, is I think the approach that you've always shown, not necessarily in the last mediation we had, but in another one, it was thinking outside of the box in terms of if the two parties are commercial parties, they've done business in the past, why would you sever that relationship if the parties can trade through and find a resolution in the future? And it's, I guess, one aspect of whenever you've got a negotiation, if you can understand the other side's perspective as well as your own, you can hopefully find some common ground and then hopefully find a way to compromise and find a way through any sort of bad blood that's happened in the past.
Absolutely, Andrew. And I think that when you're speaking about, great commercial litigators understanding the rules and the process and the principles behind the negotiation process itself, but also allowing for uncertainty, because I think I absolutely do agree and appreciate this point. I think it's a really good one because we're all human. And at the end of the day, there can be uncertainties and risks. And some of those risks can come about because of that human error or the human judgment. The other thing too, Andrew, is when you were speaking before, you mentioned a little bit about the role of judges. And I think in our legal system, we do need fantastic umpires to make sure that the rules are upheld and to make sure that we've got somebody there to be able to say when it's out of bounds, to be able to make sure the game is played by the rules. And I think that's really, really important. And one of the reasons why in our legal system we need the best possible judges, because the rules that you speak about and understanding that process is definitely a big piece of it all. And then having the right umpires in place, aka the judges and the courts, to be able to make sure that everybody's doing the right thing. And when you speak about knowing the rules and knowing the process, I did an Instagram story today just on the statutory creditors demand process and the way that that's a massive power to be able to force a wind up of a company, but then understanding also how sometimes people fall short in that process because they don't dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And so that comes back to the point you were saying before about knowing all those rules.
Is part of that, just to again go back to the jiu-jitsu type phrase, is that where a person might go for submission before position and in a sense, by not grounding themselves and putting themselves in a position where they're put in a place to maximize the, I guess, finalizing a matter. One of the things with statutory creditors demands is you've got to make sure everything is within the scope of the rules. Otherwise, very often the other side or, the opponent in the case will say, well, you haven't done this procedure and therefore everything has been a waste of time. And so it sort of reminds me of in jiu-jitsu, if you try on a submission on someone and you're not in the correct position, I think most of the instructors would scold you and say, well, you've really compromised yourself by trying to finalize the wrestle or the grapple, that at the cost of the net result in it.
I think you're right, Andrew. And I think the position that we adopt in a negotiation context, just like a jiu-jitsu context, is really, really important. If we try to get that deal closed in a negotiation, or if we try to get a dispute resolved in a mediation style negotiation, if we try to get that final level of closure in a negotiation without first having achieved the position, then we're almost doomed to fail. And if we then don't achieve that result that we were having a stab in the dark at because we didn't have the right position, then we fall. And then it can be a lot harder to then try and recover to get back the position that we should have been in. And just like that with jiu-jitsu, I find that a lot of people can become overly hungry to get this amazing leg lock or arm lock or choke, and they reach for the glory without actually having established themselves in the right position. But if we can establish ourselves in that right position first, and we can sit there comfortably and move from that position into that place of closure, I think then a lot of the pressure that would otherwise be on that step in trying to achieve that closure or the submission is gone, because we've positioned ourselves so well that we can also then, it's almost like we've affected time, where we can have a lot more clarity, a lot more time on our side, and be able to just go for that final blow, final closure on the deal, for example, and just have it all wrapped up nicely, all flowing from the place of position that we've been able to achieve. So I think it's a really good point you're making there, Andrew. Hey, Andrew, before we came on, because we've got a little bit of time left in this episode, and I really want to give respect to something that you brought and you raised before you came on today. Because you said, hey, Matthew, I got a couple of questions prepared for you. And any of our upcoming guests, I encourage you to take a leaf out of Andrew's book, because whenever you come on Rolling Through Negotiations, we love having a yarn, love having a chat, love asking each other questions, and encourage all guests to be able to freely ask questions of me as well. And I want to give respect to any question you want to ask Andrew, and you raised a question, one of those questions before. So just love to be able to give the respect and time to be able to answer any questions you've got.
As much as I've been talking about jiu-jitsu and negotiation, the perspective that I come from is when parties are in dispute. And so what I'd mentioned before was negotiation, it can be dispute resolution, but equally it could be the negotiation of a contract, or the negotiation where the parties are not necessarily opposed or in a dispute, but from a perspective of perhaps, someone wants to get a deal through to, negotiate terms of trade with someone overseas. And my interest was to say to you, you've seen dispute resolution where litigation's on board, the parties are throwing rocks at each other. How do you find that compared to the negotiation you have with someone who might be trying to push through a business sale, or, the sale of goods, and the negotiation that arises there?
Awesome, Andrew. Isn't there the old lawyer cliche of the front end work and back end work? And the front end is like the contract type transaction stuff, and the back end is more like the heated legal disputes.
Exactly.
And I love experiencing and working in both that transactional contract type work as well as the dispute resolution litigation type stuff. And one of the reasons why I love it is I feel that there are actually a lot of similarities. You know how we've been speaking about similarities between jiu-jitsu and law, for example, in this podcast. And I think that when we look at different aspects of life, and if we are overly enthusiastic, like I am as the host of Rolling Through Negotiations, I'm thinking negotiations 24/7. No, just joking. But if we are overly enthusiastic on negotiations, we could see most things in life as being a negotiation. And I'm just saying that because I'm answering from a broader perspective your question before I sort of hone in a little bit. The broader perspective is I believe that there's principles that apply to all negotiations, no matter the style of that negotiation that it's in. So, for example, some of the things we've been speaking about today to do with the ability to think clearly, the position that we have in a negotiation, using leverage in negotiation, being able to understand the process of the negotiation, being principally based is the approach, being able to allow for uncertainty, allowing for humanity. Principles like these that we've been discussing, I think equally apply to both the negotiation of disputes and also transactional type contracts. I think the interesting part is not in the similarities, but in the differences. And I honestly feel that the biggest difference between negotiations in a heated legal dispute and negotiations in a heated transactional type matter, the relationships between the parties, the emotions involved, and the reason why they're negotiating. I would say they're the three factors that are different. So, for example, in a heated legal dispute, I think that the parties typically have broken down in their communications. They're at war with one another, and typically you don't get to resolve that dispute until there's been a level of amicable communication, unless the judge makes a final order. But we know that less than 10%, I think it might even be less than 5% of cases actually go to that final court trial. So most of the cases actually resolve, which means there's a stage where parties get to when they realize, gee, we have to resolve this. And they're prepared then to have open arms and open attitude to be able to wrap things up, because it's just costing them too much emotionally, financially, stress, and they want to be able to get on with their life. And I think that level of emotion and impactful desire is not necessarily at the same magnitude in a contractual type dispute. I think that sometimes the parties' positions, the emotions involved are a lot more heated in that legal dispute type scenario as opposed to a contract type matter. And I think one of the things that I love being able to work in both the legal dispute type space as well as the contractual space is I feel like it gives a great advantage. I feel like there's a lot of lawyers out there who just work on contracts, for example. And I think that without understanding the way disputes really work, you're on the back foot, and it can become really hard to understand how contracts work. Because I've seen lawyers who just work on contracts who can be overly stressed about an element of minutia that will never really lead to a bad place anyway. So they can get overly stressed for no real reason. Whereas when you work on legal disputes, like we do, then you can see what happens if things go wrong. That gives you a better understanding of the risks. And so I think overall, understanding legal disputes, I believe, can also make somebody better at the front end type contractual stuff.
I think your answer makes a lot of sense, because I think you've got to know both sides of the coin always to really appreciate what can go, when you're reading a contract in a way, well, I guess with an eye to understanding what can go wrong, but also to be practical and pragmatic, because the cost of negotiating a contract down to, like you say, the minutiae is not going to be cost effective for either of the parties. And so that you need to have that balanced approach.
Absolutely. And then I think one of the beauties in the work that we do in that dispute type context is we get a really clear understanding of risk. And also, I think what's amazing is our ability to deal with stress and emotions becomes quite strong and resilient. And that then can make negotiating in other contexts like contractual type transactions a lot easier, because if you've built that stress muscle, then you can apply that strength of the muscle into other arenas.
Yeah, agreed.
Before we wrap up, Andrew, I just want to check in as well. Is there anything else that you'd like to ask me, or?
That was the main one. Look,
Awesome.
I really was trying to get to the bottom of the perspective that you had on front end versus back end work. And because I don't get the opportunity to negotiate front end, it's always parties that are, they in these pitched battles, and they've already sort of gone through every attempt to try and settle, and then the lawyers have been engaged. So it's always a curiosity for me to say, well, if you weren't in that battle type phase, how do you try and be sensible? How do you get the deal across the line? And also, how do you be reasonable? So, if it's the sale of goods overseas, how do you ensure that, number one, you push forward the position of the client, but also you've got to get the bargain at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely right. And there's a book, Andrew, that you've reminded me of. The book is called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff.
Mm.
And this book, I just want to get the author's name right. Just give me a second while I check out trusty Google. So yeah, it's called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff. It's all small stuff. By Richard Carlson, yeah? And this book speaks about the fact that we as people can get so stressed and so worked up on things, and we can make things feel like they're so much greater and more stressful than what they really are. But it's actually all small stuff in the end. And I think that by working in legal disputes, it helps us build that level of awareness where we can learn and understand that what people can be incredibly stressed about is often really, really small in comparison. So yeah, it's a great book. Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff, by Richard Carlson. That's the name that I said, I think. Richard Carlson. Yeah, if anyone's looking for a good book, it is a really good one. I remember when I first started out in the legal game, I used to get a bit anxious on things, and that was one of the books that really helped. Hey, Andrew, we've reached the part where we're going to have to love and leave each other in a moment. Before we do, there's a couple of things that I'd love to be able to do. I'd love to, first up, I like doing this in every episode. You've shared some absolute gems of gold with me and with our listeners here today. So, Andrew, really appreciate it. And I like to try to sum up amongst all the gems 3 takeaways that listeners can use and perhaps implement in their own negotiations. And because you've said so many amazing things, I'm not going to be able to get them all out there, but I'll just give 3 that I think will help people. And from what you've shared, 3 great lessons that I feel from today is, number 1, being able to use the BJJ, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu style lessons into negotiations. And you were speaking about the principles like humility, the learning experience itself, being able to have mentors around you in that Jiu Jitsu context, and then being able to be balanced and accurate in the approach to be able to then employ the right techniques to achieve the outcomes. So number 1 is those BJJ style lessons into negotiations. Another point that you shared that I really appreciate, and I think it's a great takeaway, is you were speaking about top commercial litigators like yourself, Andrew Burnett, in terms of understanding the rules and understanding the process to being able to use and employ a principle-based approach to the negotiation itself. I think they're really wise words, because we touched on the creditor statutory demand, but there's a lot of legal type processes and instruments and resources of the law that can come undone if the right process isn't followed. Another one that I really appreciate, and it shows a level of humility as a point as well, is allowing for that human side into negotiations. Because of the fact that we're all humans, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty in the negotiations that we experience. So that's the third takeaway point there, that uncertainty that comes from being human. So I feel like they're great points. I'd love to ask you this, Andrew, as we wrap up and we walk away from this episode of rolling through negotiations. Is there something that you would like to share with our listeners as some parting words of Andrew Burnett? As we're stepping away from this episode of rolling through negotiations and we're giving our listeners some really cool principles to be able to take away with them, I was just wondering, is there a final tip to do with that you'd like to be able to leave listeners with?
I think you covered it with the 3 points that you mentioned. Number one, to my mind, showing a degree of, or having occasion to seek the advice of people who can bring an unemotional approach or perhaps a more of an objective approach to a dispute can be helpful to parties. I think number two, always, having the opportunity to consult with an expert or someone who has experience in that area of negotiation is always a way to avoid, or I shouldn't say a way to avoid, it is a way to maximize the chances of a possible compromise or settlement or a mutually agreeable outcome. And in a way related to that, sometimes dispute resolution, an aspect of it is avoiding dispute resolution. And if you can consult with someone at an earlier point in time, and again, I think it's just having an eye on some of the details and appreciating one of the things we didn't really talk about, but you mentioned that you are sometimes involved in drafting contracts for people. I've had a number of disputes where people have just jumped into a partnership or a business sale or whatever the arrangement is without a contract, and by not having an eye on what could go wrong, sometimes they land themselves in deeper water. So I guess the final aspect is, as much as parties want to try and avoid complicating a negotiation or avoid the need to formalize an arrangement between two parties, often it's the case that you can save yourself money by having an agreed set of, rules or an agreed set of terms so that both parties know how the relationship is going to unfold based upon those rules. And without those rules, you sort of risk a small problem becoming a bigger problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. I left the silence there because I think I just felt in my gut that it'd be good to leave that one with your words being at the end of the podcast. So I just wanted to leave some silence in there. No, I think what you said is good. I think it's awesome what you said. I don't know.
But what I really wanted to say was this.
Okay.
I think very early on, you and I had a shareholders dispute, and the problem was no one had spent the time working out how the shareholding and how this company was going to be sorted out. So on one hand, one director had one view, and the second director had another view. And both of them thought they were doing the right thing by the company. But the problem was, because neither of them had sort of set out, look, if we're going to be drawing upon funds, we're only going to be drawing upon a limited amount of funds. Or, if we're going to invest in A, B, and C, we're only going to invest in it provided that both of us agree to that investment.
Yes.
And the two people were doing the right thing by each other. And they both had good intentions. But because they'd allow the relationship to, fester, and they'd allow things to sort of go unsaid, it ended up that you and I were almost like divorce counselors. Yes. And we had to get through, okay, you're both good people, you're both reasonable, but you'd come at this from different perspectives. And if they had approached it from the very beginning to sort of set out, look, we're going to have the company run in this manner, and we're going to do A, B, and C to control the company, it would have avoided 12 months of litigation. And yes, that's, part of it, that you try and you hope that people don't get involved in disputes, but sometimes it's the nature of human relations that, maybe something's unsaid, or someone misinterprets an email, and then all of a sudden, the lawyers get involved. And if at all possible, prior to, getting the lawyers involved, it might be that if a person's starting out in a business or starting out in some sort of venture or, contractual arrangement, you're better off spending a little bit of time thinking about how that arrangement is going to be put into practice, rather than just assuming that everything's going to go right, because often it doesn't. And then as a lawyer, when you're trying to unpick a business arrangement or something that has gone on, it's very difficult, because ultimately people are just so ingrained in their position that they don't want to see through and try and find, an appreciation of the other person's perspective.